Chapter 7 Aerogreen 30. As though the heavens reacted on cue, the skies soon filled with heavy gray clouds as the afternoon came on, and just as evening arrived, the air cooled, the wind rose, and it began to rain on them. Disheartened and uncomfortable, the troop of six marched on without conversation, hoping to put as many miles behind them as possible before bedding down for the night someplace drier. Gabriel was in the lead, pressing them to a brisk pace, even with his stiff leg. Then came Jameson and Percy, then Pythagoras with his matted fur, Dreher Freygood, and finally, following up at the end of the column, Commander Benjamin Binder, none of whom were efficiently clothed for rain. The drizzle was constant, and at times it came down in bitter, soaking torrents. The crumbling road wound over gray, featureless hills and through shadow-darkened valleys, mile after mile, but it remained true toward the eastern mists. Jameson turned his face from the sharp sting of the rain, using the back of Gabriel's pack as a visual focal point, longing for an umbrella. It was a tiresome march, on and on, cold and dreary. The rain made a constant ambient drone on the rocks, grass, and leaves all around them, spattering in deepening puddles, tapping relentlessly on their packs and soaking everything that they carried. New streams arose, flowing down freshly eroded gullies on the hillsides and across their path, swathing them in ankle-deep mires of deep, sucking mud that tugged at their weary feet. The shapes and silhouettes of the hills and trees were dreamlike in the twilight mists, gray and ghostly. Over their shoulders, the two Garnian scout ships cruised silently behind, as if secured to tow lines. Low above the treetops, unconcerned that their presence was now known. Nothing could be seen beyond their dark windows, but one thing was for certain: the Garnians were warmer and drier than the marching troop. The suns never showed, so the darkness of night eased in quickly. Just as Jameson began stumbling over roots and stones in the dark, Gabriel suggested that they find a place to make camp. They soon closed in together under a cluster of trees on a hillock, up against a short stone wall, their best choice, but it was neither dry nor warm there. For nearly an hour they constructed a lean-to rooftop of limbs and pine branches to help shield out the wind and rain, roofing it with large, flat poplar leaves, layered one over the other like flimsy tiles, and fresh pine boughs on top of that for insulation. Dreher got a roaring fire going near the wall, and they ate a wet dinner. Try as they might, nothing they did could warm nor cheer them. Gabriel and Dreher blamed themselves for the mishap with the creeper, and Binder, perhaps in the worst spirits of all, felt inclined to grumpily blame them both equally. I'll be right back, Jameson said modestly, stepping out into the rain to find a more private place to take care of some personal relief. He's shy, Gabriel said to the others a moment after, bashful about relieving himself in front of others. A good hygiene, Dreher said platonically, knowing the real reason privacy was needed to take care of evacuation business for the young king, but keeping that a secret. The age, he also implied. The wind whirled over and around them throughout the night, sometimes able to reach into their tiny space and pass through their wet garments like cold, ghostly hands. Although all were exhausted, most could not sleep, so the posting of a rotating guard was done, but never necessary. Jameson spent the night sitting up, shivering, pressed between Dreher Freygood and Prince Gabriel for body warmth like a human sandwich. His waterproof cloak could only do so much. The persistent rain still found ample access through the flimsy roof of leaves, dripping down into his collar, sleeves, and boot tops. He found that if he closed his eyes and pictured looking out the window from his bed in his homeland of Mead, with its daisy-dappled meadows and fountains and crystal palaces. For brief moments he could dismiss the ugly weather, and occasionally ignore the jagged little rock that pressed against his spine, no matter which way he spun. However, these moments were few and far too brief. Whenever he opened his eyes and peered out into the gloom, the dark shapes of the Guardian scout ships were always vaguely discernible in the distant trees of the south, small red lights blinking like the blinking eyes of cattle wolves. Eventually, somewhat of a dawn did break, and at once they were up and moving to get circulation back into their chilled, stiff limbs. They ate breakfast on the move. Only a handful of dried fruit and dried meat strips and wet bread for each of them, except for the carnivorous Thordian Ott, who had only the strips of meat, and he ate them ravenously. The bothersome rain came and went all day. Sometimes the clouds separated to display a vivid blue sky beyond, fringed in rainbow colors, where the sun's light grazed past. But then, like dark curtains, the walls of rain and clouds closed it all out again. The trail was swampy and thick with muck. Dark mud clung heavily to their boots and pant legs. There was a lot of quiet mumbling and cursing. Jameson often thought of Devlin and wished that he were there guiding them. He believed that things would have turned out very differently had the wizard been there with them the day before on the Creeper's Hill. They stopped frequently to rest. Feet were sore, wet, and blistered. Skin was chapped and irritated from the friction of wet clothes. Everything in the packs was soaked through, and this made them heavy and burdensome to carry. Ott's fur was tangled, lumpy, and flattened, but oddly enough, he didn't seem to mind. Outside of Percy, Ott was, perhaps, the one member of the troop who complained the least about the rain. Before the sun set the next night, outdoorsman Dreher Freygood optimistically predicted the coming of a dry night, and even drier morning ahead of them, and the others concurred. The signs were clear. Red in the morning, travelers take warning. Red at night, travelers delight. Usually that old saying held true. The nurturing rain said more than done their job there, cleaning the air, refreshing the earth, and feeding and hydrating the trees. The custodial rain clouds had moved on to continue their good work elsewhere. Spirits began to rise. The troop found a clearing among a circle of ancient pines, and before dark they warmed themselves against a raging fire that could be seen for miles. No wood was spared. The wet logs steamed and hissed and popped and whistled before eventually drying out and catching a blaze. Then they turned through the firewood cycle from full-on red golden glory to piles of blackened ash and smoldering coals, hotter than any oven, perfect for the stew of pork, onions, wild tubers, and crunchy pine nuts Dreher had gathered and was busily preparing for them. Clothes and blankets were hung to dry in the tree branches, and small A-frames made of sticks they had set up near the roaring blaze. The food was soggy, but the tea and the wine were perfect. The crew took time to pull burrs from stockings, mend cuts and scratches, and check each other over for wood ticks and leeches. The feeling of warmth was a welcome reprieve and a reason for occasional laughter and song. Dreher brought out a safely stored mandolin and serenaded them until they began to nod off. How it remained functional after all they had gone through was hard to grasp. After a full belly and a draught of wine, Jameson could not hold his eyes open a minute longer. His clothes and sleeping blanket were warm and wonderfully dry, laid upon a thick bed of moss and dry pine boughs, only yards away from the glow of a throbbing orange coals. Above the treetops, thousands of diamond-like stars twisted and twinkled, as if there on display exclusively for the weary campers. Jameson dreamed of Deadland Dane that night. The wizard, oddly enough, was made out of smoke in his dream, a dark, swirling mass of thick gray smoke. Jameson could smell him, too, although it wasn't until the next morning that he would realize that it was probably the smell of a spark that had burned a small hole in his pillow that had inspired that illusion. Deadland was in a small, dark room that was filled from floor to ceiling with books. He was searching for something, frustrated and anxious. He pulled the books from the shelves with both hands, but they turned to ash before hitting the floor with an explosion of dust. Jameson was looking in, as if from a thick glass window, and he cried out to him, but no sound came from his mouth. He tried and tried, but was unable to reach the old man. The Deadland of smoke was encased within a thick glass crystal sphere upon an old cluttered table, within a dark forgotten room, within a dark forgotten castle, thousands of miles away and hundreds of years ago. 31. 3 more days passed in a similar manner, the troop marching diligently during the day and resting as best they could, much more comfortably thanks to the kindlier weather, through the cool nights. They had left the knotted grassy knolls of the creeper land far behind them. There were clusters of woods before them now as the hills steadily rose and fell, and they passed many lakes and ponds full of cattails and lily pads, swollen full from the recent rains. The courses of what must have been millions of hidden tree frogs was often overbearing. Fording fattened streams was a common but necessary nuisance for the traveling party, keeping them soggy and sore from the knees down. When Jameson awoke the next morning, Gabriel was sitting close to the fire with a curious smile upon his face. Dreher and Ott had already finished packing and were busily cleaning up their camp. They seemed ready to depart. The suns were warm and the skies were clear and bright. The morning air was brisk and refreshing to the palate, and small gray moths fluttered in the nearby trees. Jameson was instantly famished. "Good morning," Gabriel said, bringing Jameson his makeshift camp breakfast. "Hope you slept well." "Like a proverbial log," he answered, brushing leaves from his hair with his fingertips. "The best since, we lost the ship." "Good. Ready for another day of it?" Jameson pulled his blanket aside and reached for his boots, feeling inside each of them to see if they had dried sufficiently next to the fire. "I do believe I can go on," he said with a small degree of humor and forced enthusiasm. "It'd be nice to have a carriage about now, though, drawn by sturdy horses if you could manage it. Or at least have my breakfast served to me in a warm, dry parlor somewhere away from these moths." Just then, Commander Binder and Master Pilot Percy came jogging into view from the distant trees on the far rise. They crossed the hollow and came jogging up the hill through a narrow fissure between the rocks, looking tired and apprehensive. The rest of the troop paused as if awaiting news from them. Jameson was tempted to ask them if they had been out hunting for the cave they had left Tungulin to locate somewhere, but didn't. "Oh, we lost him," Binder replied between labored breaths when he had drawn near. "About 4 miles to the south." "Lost? Who?" Jameson asked. Apparently he had missed something that morning as he slept in later than all the others. "The Miserably was just too swift," Binder continued. "We haven't had a chance in hell of following them on foot. But the good news is that it drew the smaller Garnian sled ship away, maybe for good," Percy added. "To what purpose? We don't know. Their motives remain unclear. Chasing it, I don't believe they were friendly to one another." "What? What have I missed?" Jameson stammered. Apparently quite a lot." "Well, you're a good deep sleeper when you do sleep, that's for certain," Gabriel answered. "I'm awake now." Gabriel found a seat next to him, tightening his bootlaces. "Just a bit of harmless excitement is all." Jameson stared. And? A bit of a story? Jameson nodded. Well, Gabriel said last night, while most everyone else was asleep, we had a visitor of sorts, he said, clearing his throat. I was still on watch. It was as pitch as tar. Percy and I were stoking the fire, a final time for the night, when we heard a strange noise coming from the other side of this very hill, from up there, around that stand of beech trees on that exposed ridge, he said, pointing. It was a shrill and animal cry of distress, like some large predatory raptor, was all we could tell at first. Now, that smaller Garnian scout ship that had been following us immediately turned aside to investigate. So we thought it best to wake Binder to stand guard here while we went to see what it was as well, out of curiosity, make sure we were safe. We followed the tree line over the shoulder of the hilltop, staying near or under the overhanging thickets wherever we could. Percy and I. In the pale light, we did indeed discover a large bird up there, a full-grown Miserably, saddled and bridled, but at the time riderless, and it appeared to be embattling with something that we were at first unable to discern in the darkness. The bird was quite evidently struggling and fighting with some dire foe by the desperate cries it was making, crashing through the underbrush and stirring up clouds of dead leaves and dirt. We crept in on hands and knees as near as we were able. Its right leg was stuck or trapped in something, judging by the way it was hopping about in circles, like it was caught in a hunter's trap. It flapped its big featherless wings ferociously and was pecking vehemently at whatever was holding it. Well, we slid in a bit closer on our bellies, and as our eyes finally adjusted to the night's blackness, we could finally see the flightless bird's adversary. Curled and twisting at its feet was a huge, black and white striped Cingolius dragon snake. Its jaws were clamped tight upon the great bird's foot, and it was attempting to pull it back into its cave to devour. A what? Jameson asked. Cingolius, Gabriel repeated. Dragon snake. It's big and multi-horned, not the same kind that was in the process of eating you on the first day we met. A rare, legless dragon of some ancient origin. A constrictor. Ambush predator. Quite the spectacle to behold. Well, I wish I could have seen it, Jameson declared. Well, it was over before we knew it, Gabriel said. But that's not the most shocking discovery we made, Percy chimed in. Tell them about the rider, Prince. Gabriel continued on with his wildland encounter. Of course, as we squatted there in the brush, a strange-looking man suddenly emerged from the brush on the opposite side of the vale. The Miserably rider himself, silver war sword unsheathed and flashing. He was a large fellow, dressed in violet and gold stripes, worn and torn, with a strange helmet and an unusual handmade armor. He struck at the Cingolius with incredible speed and dexterity, and within moments the dragon was dead. A Binder joined us there around then, Percy said, and advised us that the second Garnian scout ship had also gone missing too, both of our predators. He had come looking for us, fearing for our safety, I suppose, and to return to camp, Binder said. How strange. Anything happen afterward? Jameson wanted to know. Gabriel had finished his packing. We watched the rider check his steed over, doctoring it, soothing it in his strange tongue. He kept looking continuously over his shoulder into the trees above his head as he mounted it, as if wary of something lurking there. Then we saw what it was, the two Garnian scout ships that had been trailing us there, hovering silently above him. Why, I wonder? Well, as did we. Who was this rider so important that he drew our tails away? He goaded his steed, and in a flash they fled down the slope in the opposite direction of where we were hidden, and off into the shadows, and was instantly gone. The Garnians were off in pursuit, setting us free from them. Curious. Who was he, I wondered, Jameson asked, having enjoyed the breakfast story. What kind of a man was he? What was he doing out here? Does it in any way involve us or our mission, do you think? Gabriel smiled. I don't believe so, but it will remain a mystery, I suppose, and probably always will. He was an odd-looking fellow for sure. Gabriel turned to camp. Binder then added, Percy and I decided to try to follow the bird rider on further, if we could, to confirm our pests were gone. But he left us in the dust, and soon the trail grew cold. A mature Userapi can cross territory impossible by man on foot, and at speed they can often outrace a fast horse. Dreher curiously added, It was strange that the Garnians would take such an interest in this lone Userapi rider. They forsook us to pursue him instead. Very strange. We saw the larger of the two scout ships circle back toward our camp, so we turned aside and headed back ourselves, Percy said. The Birdman was long gone. I have never even heard of a Userapi, Jameson said, flabbergasted, or a Singolius dragon. They sound terrifying. Two infamous animals in the wildlands, the prince responded, preparing to depart. There are many strange and fantastical creatures throughout this kingdom, that is for sure. Jameson rose to his feet. The crew seemed busy packing for the day's trek, so he felt he needed to get responsible and comply likewise instead of dawdling any longer. The day's hike began. For a few miles, hardly a word was spoken between them because nothing needed to be. There was no reason to complain or whine. The skies had opened up freely in all directions, which was nice, quite the opposite of the storm clouds they had recently faced. Their travel was dry, and the temperature was pleasant to all. They spotted a few small, peaceful villages in a few directions, with some property hedgerow divides here and there, and some grazing livestock and wattled fences. To the south, a few green barrows appeared, a pensive place to bury the local dead. Nothing fresh could be seen. They seemed to be well tended by the remaining friend and family members in the nearby villages there for their departed loved ones, whenever the need be, out of respect for those who had passed. I once witnessed a flock of wild Userapi destroy an entire mining village once, Dreher Freygood went on to say, to pass the time. Long ago, and not all in one night. They must flock over the hills as birds flock heavily in the sky, Jameson surmised. Sounds horrible. Dreher shook his head affirmatively. Oh, yeah. I was but a young man still, in my first year of flight school, and we were camped in a cute cave on a hillside near Fugel, near the river Meese. Down below us was a strip mining village, mostly Gythote, but a fair number of Tiberlians made their home there as well. Good people. The Userapi flock came charging in one night, unexpectedly, a stampede of bipedal carrion birds. Oh my goodness, Dreher. It's said that traditionally they're scavengers by nature, carrion eaters. But these birds were not scavenging anything. They were vicious hunters and killers. They went for the easy targets, too. Children, small women, livestock, and pets. For 3 nights in a row, this went on, always around twilight. The miners made a stand, the best that they could, but no one stayed there for the 4th night. Conversation went dead for a few minutes. Oh, and I once saw a Singolius swallow a man whole, Gabriel interjected into the lull. In the Singolius's defense, this particular man deserved his fate. Long story. I'd rather face a nest of Singoliuses, Ott said, waving at two small gray moths that fluttered around his face, than one of these pesky moths, infernal insects. They tortured me all night, fluttering in and out of my nose and my ears while I tried to sleep. If we're on the road that I believe we are, Dreher forewarned, shoveling dirt onto the dead campfire, I can tell you we'll be seeing a lot more of them before we see less of them. 32. Gabriel's limp had worsened as the long march continued, but he said nothing about it. Distant thunder from the north kept them moving at a brisk pace, tired and apprehensive, wishing for some place indoors to retire for the night. The trail widened as it crossed a broad, flat, featureless meadow. All the tall, straight pines disappeared behind them, and ahead, in their stead, loomed large, twisted Ords pines. These unusual evergreens bore very long, dark needles, a corky, umber-colored bark, and pulpy cones. They were covered with a hanging lichens and parasitic tree eels that dangled like decorative ornaments from the twisting branches. Beyond the trees, dark, jagged rocks jutted up like watchful giants, boulders bordering the corners of the nearby hills. As they drew in closer and entered the trees, a large population of shaggy gray squirrels took turns dashing in and out of the large community nests that they had made from the long, thin Ords needles and thick olive green moss. With eager curiosity, they watched the troop pass by underneath them. They chattered with short barks and whipped their fluffy white tails threateningly. Ott said something in passing about squirrel meat, but the crew hurried on without stopping. No, Jameson had snapped. She liked them and couldn't bear the thoughts of killing and eating one of them. The ground was covered with debris from the trees, but the trail, for the most part, was clear and dry. Still, they often found themselves dodging muddy water holes from the previous downpours. As Dreher had predicted, the moths became more abundant as the day wore on. They danced and swirled hither and thither in the trees and in the tangles of the underbrush along the trail sides. They fluttered gaily in the air all around them, the males chasing the females in an aggressive courtship ritual, as most all species did. How much further to Long Gray Bluffs? Jameson asked as the trail took a hard turn, heading up a steep embankment. This road has been heading uphill since we began today, and I need a rest. My legs are burning, and these moths are more than I can bear. I was tempted to reply that she could make a meal out of them, but didn't. 4 more days, Dreher said. 3 if we rise a few hours before dawn each morning and press a bit harder before we camp each night. Long Gray Bluffs is a small town, not much more than a busy crossroads of sorts, really, run by a rich old tyrant and his sons. I don't know how much luck we'll have when we get there. I haven't seen the old coot in 30 years, and he wasn't known as the friendliest host in Galgaraya even then. We can negotiate with him, I'm sure, Binder mumbled. I think we could be a fairly persuasive team if we set our minds to it. A soft, rolling thunder rumbled continuously in the distance. Ott shook himself like a dog shaking off water. Moths flew from his fur like a cloud of gray dust. He roared in anger. Pestilence, he growled. They're nesting in my fur. Yes, these moths are aerodares, Dreher told them. Gray aerodares. Aerodares, Gabriel said. I fear I know what fate soon awaits us if the aerodares here are like the aerodares of my own country, both the day butterflies and the night moths. Dreher acknowledged him with a respectful nod. I'm afraid they are, Gabe. As I suspected, this road does indeed lead through Aerogreen, their breeding ground. I'm not exactly sure if they're in season, but I have a feeling we're going to time it just about right. Or better said, timed it wrong. That we'd best travel through Aerogreen by day if we can, Gabriel said. If they're nocturnal, like the red aerodares in Persia, they'd be a bit more docile and complacent in the sun's light. More docile? Moths? How dangerous could they be? Jameson asked. They're just moths. A small herd of elk could be seen migrating through a hollow just before them and soon gone. I've always strived to avoid Aerogreen when hunting around this land, Gabriel answered, because of warnings I got from the locals. There's a story of an entire brigade that was wiped out in that cursed valley. By moths? Ott growled. That's right. Aerogreen can be a very dangerous place, Dreher continued, like a teacher giving a lesson in class. They have effects on those who cross their sacred valley. Completely overpowering, sometimes even devastating. Collectively, they can somehow alter minds in both fascinating and horrible ways that I cannot wholly describe. Are they carnivorous? Binder said lightheartedly. Or more seriously, can they sting like bees? Dreher chuckled. I myself have only been through this valley once, although it was a long time ago. It was during midwinter when their numbers were small. Still, it was not an enjoyable experience. And yet, strangely enough, even still to this day, I deeply crave that magical hypnosis again for some unknown reason. It was quite an experience. I don't understand, Jameson said. Is it bad or good? Dreher shrugged. Like many things in life, I suppose, he said. Once you've crossed Aerogreen, you'll never be the same again. You'll always want to go back there, submerge yourself in them for the pain and pleasure that it offers. You'll be haunted by that desire of comfort and may still welcome your doom your entire life thereafter. It's like knowing the inevitable peace of death. Ott growled. Well, I don't care for the sound of that at all, Jameson responded. Can't we find another way? Binder suggested. Let's go around to the north. On foot, it would add more than a week to our schedule, maybe more. And that is if you have cliff clingers carrying you, which we don't. You can see the cliff walls from here, Dreher told them, pointing. The gray walls were sheer and featureless. And there are no supply stores along that route. Barren at best. To the south, the orge pines are so dense and tangled that no road has ever been cleared through them, blanketing the hills and valleys for hundreds of miles in all directions. Beyond those steely pines is yet another wall of rock that nearly equals the mesa cliffs of the great rock Galoth. And again, slip pickings as far as hunting for food. So, no, unfortunately for us, without Skycraft, the road through Aerogreen is the only road forward. We should be safe enough if we stay on the path and hold ourselves together, Gabriel said as encouragingly as he could. It's navigable. After all, this road was made by men, and it does pass straight through the Valley of the Moths. Dreher reluctantly agreed. Most mishaps are caused by travelers who advance into the swarm foolhardily, he said. Since we know somewhat of what to expect, we should be able to pass safely and quickly if we keep our heads. Now listen closely. Here's what I know of the place. Aerogreen is a vast, cylindrical, bowl-shaped valley with a long and sordid history, he began. Our road crosses it from west to east. There's a deep green stream that enters the vale from the root walls of the impenetrable Orge pine forest to the north called the Aerogreen River Run. It churns through the cliff drain of the valley, through twisting rapids and waterfalls, intersecting our road over a wide, shallow ford, crossable by foot. Then the river run continues its way downstream from there and eventually exits Aerogreen over a great waterfall, some distance directly south over an immeasurable cliff. Now be prepared. The water of Aerogreen is icy cold and filled with the aquatic aerodare eggs and caterpillar larvae, although the moths were so thick during my first journey through that I could barely see the stream at all. The aerodares breed along the banks, billions of them, so thick that it is nearly a solid mass. When the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat their way up the banks toward the orge pines, where they cocoon. There they hatch as aerodares, and the cycle continues. So when we reach the stream, we'll still be blindfolded and blind, but at least you'll know that we're halfway through the Aerogreen Valley. Keep your head. Hold fast to your concentration. Don't get distracted, and we should be able to make it to the other side in less than an hour from the time we head down into it. What's going to happen to us down in there? Jameson asked. I can't entirely remember what effect the moths had on me when I passed through Aerogreen. I only know that I was in danger of losing my way and my mind, and I was willing to gratefully accept that happening. The hallucinations were hypnotizing. You'll all be offered some alternative of various non-realities. Ott growled. We have worse problems than moths right now, he said. Look behind us, gentlemen. They have returned with reinforcements. Above the pines in plain sight were not just 2, but 3 Garnian scout ships and 1 good-sized fighter, and they were making no attempt to hide themselves anymore. They flew at a walking pace, like abominable kites on strings. Jameson sucked in his breath as yet another Garnian fighter ship edged over the treetops. There are 5 of them now. I think they may be onto us, Binder said. We can't defend ourselves against that fighter craft from the ground like this. We have no choice but continue forward, Gabriel answered. Let's move quickly. I think we could take them with the guerrilla tactics, Ott said. Anyone with me? Keep your weapons at hand, Gabriel continued. If they do attack, we should separate and meet again together on this side of the Aerogreen Valley. Or, if that fails, move on forward and rendezvous at Long Gray Bluffs. He glanced at the hovering ships. Jameson, come, stay close by my side. I hear thunder again, Jameson said, battling at the moths in front of his face. But the skies are cloudless, and the thunder does not end. It sounds as though we're marching directly into it. That's not thunder, Dreher said, nor waterfalls. Those are moth wings. 33. The muddy, weedy dirt road they had been following eventually turned to smooth stone beneath their feet. At one time long ago, it had been an active thoroughfare between 2 or more flourishing towns, long since extinct. A million wagon wheels had formed 2 smooth wheel ruts in the stone. But what cities and civilizations they had been, no one could now remember. Boots and hooves and trundling wheels. There were no major cities within hundreds of miles of them in any direction now. Countless rains had continued the work, keeping the stone road as smooth as spotted sienna silk. The troop continued to climb as the road weaved up the sloping mountainside. Directly before them, the old and hoary road divided. An ivy-covered marker of faded brown stone stood in the center of the divide, etched with an ancient script of Tiberlian letters, indiscernible to all. One route went off to the right in a long, gradual, curving slope to the top. The other, to their left, zigzagged much more steeply up the stones and broken steps directly up the hillside, joining the longer, easier way at the crest. The aerodares had grown so thick around them that the hillside and the scrubby trees were now gray and alive with movement. Gabriel chose the steeper of the two paths, and all agreed. The stairs were weather-beaten, old, and crumbling. Each step they took unintentionally crushed moths underfoot, once dead and alive. The thunder from the beating wings of the aerodares in the valley over the next rise was not unlike the thunder of a waterfall, mixed with the sound of a massive wind. The roar was alive. "The smell!" Jameson cried out, coughing at the fetid stench. "It's unbearable." The stairs had eroded away at one point, so Gabriel paused to boost Jameson up onto the next large stone. The young king stood and turned from that vantage point, looking back over the long valley from which they had come. Shielding his eyes, he could see the path they had taken, winding for miles back through the trees and far beyond into the warm, hazy distance. The Garnians were now nowhere in sight, which made all of them nervous. All 6 members of the troop were weary from the road and distracted by the moths, making them ever more vulnerable to a surprise attack. As Jameson helped to pull Gabriel up beside him, for one quick second, he thought he saw movement on the hilltop above him, just 2 small shadows beyond the veil of dead bushes and swirling moths, dashing quickly across the upper corner rim of the nearby rise. He squinted. The blazing sunlight was shining directly into his eyes, but he saw nothing else. Whatever they were gone, like puffs of smoke. "Did you see something?" Gabriel asked. I'm not sure," Jameson said. "Shadows, I think." "Something has to cast a shadow," the prince advised. "They do not exist on their own." One by one, the troop climbed to the top level shelf at the head of the staircase and paused to have a drink of water, to clear their throats, and to catch their breaths. Never had their packs seemed more burdensome. Years and years' worth of accumulated dead and dying moths had accrued, piling a foot deep beneath their feet like a dry, dusty, ashy gray snow. Dreher took the lead, advising them to ready their ropes so that they could secure themselves to one another at the top before plunging through the valley. "Aerogreen is right over this ridge," he called out from the summit. The rumble of tiny wings was incredibly loud. "You can see the far side from here." "That'll be 30 Dillons, please," said an odd little voice from behind a dead tree. It was as sharp and clear as a bell. Jameson was the closest to the strange voice. He spun around and stepped quickly backwards, almost stumbling. Gabriel's hand went swiftly to his sword. From behind the gnarly tree, 2 little people stepped spryly out, and an old man and a little old woman who seemed to match one another. Palms outstretched, shy eyes blinking as rapidly as the moth's wings around them. They were dressed in colorful, tattered clothing from head to foot, apricot, cream, and mint green. Both were balding, nearly toothless, and covered with gray aerodares. "That'll be 30 Dillons," repeated the little old man. "Apiece." Jameson smiled at them, supposing that the odd little couple were the ones who had cast the shadows he had seen just moments before while climbing up the hill. 30 Dillons, Gabriel replied playfully, drawing closer to them. "For what?" "No closer," they piped, signaling him as they stepped nervously back. They both leaned, humped over to the left, somewhat synchronized. 30 Dillons to pass, they said together, now smiling their wide, toothless smiles. Don't sneeze or you'll frighten the bookends away, Binder grousely replied. Why should we pay to pass here? Gabriel asked. You don't own this valley. The moths do. The two elf-like characters giggled and hugged each other. Must pay to pass, great warrior man, insisted the little blushing lady. Caretakers. 30 each, times 6 of you, that's 200 Dillons even. I think your math is off, Binder replied. I'm sorry, but we have no Dillons with us today, little friends, Gabriel advised. He stepped toward them, and at once they were gone, somehow blending instantly into the moths and the trees and the bushes all around them. No, no, came a little scolding voice from behind them. The troop spun to find the couple standing on a tree stump on the opposite side of the small clearing. No closer, the little man said, shaking an angry finger. He stomped his foot. 30 Dillons apiece to cross, and 50 for each of your airboats. The troop followed the wood elf's gaze into the trees behind them. There hovered the Garnian skycrafts. They had returned to haunt their journey and were drawing in closer. No Dillons, Gabriel reiterated. You folk have no need for man's money. You only hoard it and never spend it. And besides, those aren't our airboats. They're unwanted tag-alongs. You'll have to speak to them if you want gold or silver coin. He pressed past them toward the rumbling mass. Let's go. Let's get this over with. Wait, cried the elf. 20 Dillons. The others filed past them. Dreher was laughing, staying out of the whole debate. Go bother someone else, Ott growled at them as he went by. We're busy today, little man. Jameson reached into his pocket and found one shiny gold Dillon, and he flipped it toward them with his thumb. It landed on the ground near their shoeless feet. They jumped on it, laughing and singing. Thank you, they said. Thank you, graciously. Jameson turned and ran, quickly joining the rest of the troop at the crest of the hill. What opened up there before them was beyond the grasp of reality or belief. The valley of Aerogreen lay open before them, an ocean of hypnotic movement in a million shades of gray. It was an awesome, incredible theater of nature, more immense and powerful than Jameson or any of the rest of the troop had previously envisioned. Jameson felt suddenly quite minute in comparison to its splendor. I've never seen anything like this before, Percy said in Mahekian awe. Nor I, said Ott. It is a vast insect sea of life. When I passed through here before, Dreher told them, it was not even a quarter of this size. I fear we have arrived at the height of their breeding season. It will be very difficult to pass. I fear we will have much more trouble than I forewarned you about once we are inside that whore. Just 10 or 15 yards ahead of them, the road at their feet disappeared completely down into the massive swarm. And then again, on the far distant side, directly across from them, barely discernible, it resurfaced again, rising from the swirling gray sea that covered it in between. However, the distance to the other side was deceiving. It could have been a quarter of a mile across. It could have been 4. The perspective continued to shift before their squinted eyes, creating an optical illusion of swirling waves. One thing was for certain. Beckoning green hills, dotted with golden summer flowers, awaited them on the higher grounds of that distant shore. To the north, on their left, forests of netted and impenetrable orange pines closed in upon the cylindrical bowl-shaped valley. The rocks and cliffs beyond stood steep and jagged. To the south, a blue sky beckoned. It was there that the river run flowed out of the heart of Aerogreen and left that land, falling over a sheer cliff of unfathomable depths in a shadowy, sunless lands far, far below. Gabriel shouted an order. Get your ropes! A moth flew into his mouth and he spit it out. Secure yourselves in a straight line, one after the other. If one is lost, then we're all lost. Hold tight. Cover your mouths with kerchiefs, if you have them, Dreher advised. It'll help you breathe. You're going to feel as if you're being smothered. Jameson found himself oddly enthralled with the rippling, swirling, surfaceless waves dancing before his eyes. He began to experience a form of mild hypnosis that a flowing brook or the coals of a campfire could likewise inspire in him. Was this what Dreher had warned them about? Because it wasn't bad. It wasn't that bad at all. It was pretty. It was nice. He barely noticed the moths crawling about on his hands and face anymore. There are two things to remember as we cross, Dreher cried to the others. First, the moths have a natural pull to the right, toward the cliffs. Remember Gabriel's story about the doomed army? Such was their demise. Avoid that pull. The moths will lead you over the edge of the cliff if they can. Overcompensate an inch to the left with every step you take, as if fighting a strong wind. Secondly, remember to concentrate on the task at hand and avoid the overwhelming psychic call of the moths. Hold on to the rope tight because we will have no further communication once we enter their domain. Stay together. Breathe when you can. Concentrate and veer slightly to the left. How deep will it be? Gabriel inquired concerning the stream at the valley space. The water. The river run was only knee-deep when I crossed it, and perhaps 20 feet from shore to shore. But it will be deeper now, what with recent rains, so take all appropriate precautions. Focus. Focus. Jameson, come and stay close to me, Gabriel said. Tie this loop around your wrist and hold on at all costs. He stepped toward the thunderous living mass of moths. The rope went taut, and all followed. See you on the other side. They began to proceed in single file. Wait! Wait! They heard from behind them as they were one by one enveloped by the swarm. Wait, I say! Jameson turned quickly, squinting through the moths at the figure dashing up the rise toward them. He waved his hand at the moths before his eyes. Who is that? He cried, stalling. He was being yanked along like a dead weight. Percy disappeared into the moths, then Binder. Sire, the rope! Shouted Ott above the roar. He took King Day by the hand and forced the rope into it. You must hold on or be left behind, or worse, it's just the wood elves. Don't be deceived. No, it's not the wood elves, cried Jameson, although no one could hear him anymore. He was being yanked along like an anchor. Stop! Go back! It's Devlin! 34. Down they descended into the living sea made of fluttering insects. Moths immediately filled all the airspace around them, delving deeply into their clothes and packs. Even if it were possible to open their eyes, which it was not, the sun's light could not have penetrated the deep, dark cloud of solid gray. Deeper and deeper they submerged with each step, the pressure of the moths against their skin increasing as they dove. I have some great news for everyone, a voice suddenly said, as clear as day. It was Percy. The moths do not seem to have an effect on me, and I am able to communicate. They were glad to hear his voice, a clear bell of sanity in a world without dimensions and conscious control. I can feel the slight pull to the right, as Dreher foretold, he said. I will remind you of his words. Do not compromise with them. Stay to the left, move slowly, one step at a time. Retain your own minds. The ascent was not smooth. It was steep and rough. They felt their way forward blindly with their feet, stepping off shelves of slimy rock and often stumbling together. There was no way to tell if they were still on the road anymore at that point. or if they had headed off the bank towards some perilous hidden chasm. The moths underfoot, alive and dead, were as soft as a thick carpet of cotton, as fine as dust, and several feet deep. It was slow going and awkward. The smell was of sweet rot and decay. Then the moths began to call to them. It was almost like a song, the soft thrum of millions and millions of moth wings that surrounded and penetrated. The troop of 6 were now totally immersed in a resonating, somber rumble, as if slowly and methodically becoming a part of it. As their bodies became one with the frequencies that spanned all audible ranges and beyond, they assimilated almost immediately. The effects of the strange valley began to work on them, each one responding differently to the exotic, even erotic, wing songs. Stepping one foot over the other until he reached the far side, Gabriel's concentrated on that 1 feet alone. In one flashing moment of weakness, he briefly listened. For one split second, he allowed himself to experience the sensations of the tiny wings fluttering all over his body, in his clothes, on his face, in his hair, and instantly, he forgot everything. His mission, his name, the rest of the troop. It was as if none of that had ever existed. He was immediately alone and in slumbering bliss. There was a constant weight, a comforting pressure all over him. It was very peaceful and seemingly forever. He suddenly realized to his delight and astonishment that he was not even awake, but asleep at home in bedchambers, some other place. Fast asleep and dreaming soundly. The weight upon him, nothing but his own soft down blankets on the bed surrounding him. It was a sleep so divine that it felt like love, and he chose never to wake again because it was just too damn good. Onward, Percy said to them all. The troop was wavering, struggling in different directions. The ground began to rise underfoot, and he wondered if they had headed back in a circle. To the left! Stay focused! Jerefregood had long ago forgotten what the effects of his first experience in Aerogreen had been on him all those years ago, but now it returned back as if that original journey across had only occurred the day before. The moths were so ticklish. The tiny feather-like creatures were everywhere, on his neck, in his shirt, in his shoes, and between his toes. It was sheer torture. It was so much more intense than his first trip through Aerogreen had been. There were so many more of them. He squeezed the loop of rope tight with his right hand, attempting to fight off the aerodares with his left, but to no avail. He laughed out loud and squirmed, and then he laughed louder, and within seconds his laughter was muffled as if he were trying to laugh with a mouthful of bread. Jameson wanted to tell them all to go back, but he had forgotten why. The moths were singing to him. The beating of their wings were some kind of soothing orchestral instrument, and he was adrift on the music they made. It was not unlike the soft melody of harps or gentle coursing of water on glass. He was flying between the world of wake and sleep, desiring only to lie down and listen for a few minutes. Couldn't the rest of them hear the lullaby? It was so dark and lovely. What is happening to you all? Percy cried to them. He jerked at the rope. Stay together. Don't veer off or we're all doomed. Ott roared, cursed, and then he fell silent. He occasionally slashed at the swarm with claws outstretched, feeling the resistance as if he were immersed in water. He could not fight this foe by any means that he knew of, which frustrated him to the point of madness. He was not a natural swimmer by Thordian nature. Commander Benjamin Binder found himself leading them onward from his place at the center of the rope, with the rest of them dangling like weights. on either end of it. He could not exactly tell where he was heading, but he continued to march, foot over foot, deaf, dumb, and blind. It was dark now, with nothing but gray. Gray light through his eyelids, gray sound, gray taste. And the taste was so musty. The dust of chalk, the flavor of ashy dust. He was walking through gray stone, pulling the weight of the world behind him. Or was he part of that stone, he wondered. That was certainly it. He was himself part of the stone that surrounded him, and it was pointless to walk on. Why attempt it? Could rocks walk? Why should they move? Rocks were made to rest, firmly and solidly. Rocks were unmovable. Take one more step, Percy cried. One more, and another. Binder's existence in that great gray stone was of no consequence. His life existence was now trivial in the grand scheme of the universe. Rocks did not move on their own. They held things down. They weighted the earth under their feet so that it would not float away into space. They sat for eons and just slowly eroded by wind and rain. He had to stop now because he realized he was not alive, and in fact, he had never existed at all. He was a great rock, important, strong, and heavy. Gabriel stumbled back into the lead again, stepping suddenly knee-deep into the stream of Aerogreen. It was icy cold and swift, instantly sobering him. It jarred his senses back to life for a moment, and he fought to retain them. The moths around him were at their thickest, nearly a solid mass, and it was choking the air out of him. Keep on, he heard Percy cry, and the voice inspired him to do so. He pulled hard at the rope, encouraging his fellow travelers onward, into the stream of Aerogreen. Halfway there, halfway to the other side. Remember, concentrate, the Mahekian cried to them all. Ignore the urge. Resist the hypnotism. Ignore. Remember the far shore. Binder splashed into the stream, followed by Ott. It revived them both just enough. I am beginning to feel strange now, Percy said. I feel so helpless myself, like a little child, but I do feel so happy. Ott roared. He was infuriated with his loss of control. I am happy. I'm a child again, Percy sang. Deliriously, he pulled against the rope as though he wanted to run off and play. Come play with me. He tried to free his hand from the tight loop he had secured around his wrist. They stumbled through the water, and instantly it grew deeper. It was remarkably cold and biting, ice water from the mountain snows, and it was running swiftly. They suddenly realized their peril as it rose up higher on them with every step they took to cross it. Hold on, Percy called. The bottom is slick. The aerodare larvae are as slick as snails. Jameson was up to his hips, and he was having trouble keeping his footing. Gabriel, I'm slipping! He stumbled and slid over and over again, grasping desperately onto Ott's belt for support. His pack came loose and drifted away with the torrents. The Thordian was growling with every struggling breath he was able to take. Binder was the first to fall and go under. He held onto the rope with one hand while grappling at larva-covered boulders under the surface with the other. He grasped one and held on. Binder fell in, Percy cried. Help him up. Commander Binder is under the water. Hold on, Jameson, Gabriel cried out, pulling his hand free from the knotted loop, but he could say nothing further. He traversed down the rope, hand over hand, past Percy, and seized Binder's wrist beneath the water, pulling on him with all his might. The rapids pushed hard against him, but he was somehow able to keep his footing. Binder found a foothold and stood, momentarily crying out before his mouth filled with moths again. Come on, Percy cried. Let's cross it. We're halfway there. We can make it. Don't stop now. Don't give in. We're halfway across. With all his strength and concentration, Gabriel moved back down the rope to find King Jameson grasping onto each of his comrades for support along the way, even if he had to carry the boy to the far shore on his shoulders. His only thought now was to get young King Day up and out of that hellish nightmare as soon as was possible. The rest of the troop would just have to fend for themselves now. In their minds, they were lost. They were all moving again, step by step, making good progress across the stream of Aerogreen, when suddenly Binder slipped and fell in again, coming free of the rope, and he dragged Pythagoras off along with him. Then they heard Jameson cry out, "Gabriel!" And he too was gone, swept off beneath the raging waters with the other two. "Something's wrong," Percy said, holding on to a limp rope. "They've fallen in." "Go on," Gabriel cried to the two who still remained standing, Dare and Percy, and then he dove blindly and without thought into the swift, icy water, allowing the current to pull him along with it. He stretched out his arms and legs, feeling for the sides and the bottom. His hands slid through the squirming aquatic caterpillar larva like oil in mud. He scraped his shoulder against a sharp rock, unable to cry out. The current was carrying him faster and faster. He swam with it, stretching his hands out in front of him, hoping to seize the boy or anyone floating along ahead of him. If only he could catch hold of Jameson and pull him to the side. He could not rise for a breath, no matter how badly he needed one, nor open his eyes underwater. It was too dark and murky to see. He tried one last time to swim ahead, but the current tossed him from side to side. His head hit a rock, sending flashes of sparkling white spots before his clenched eyes. He was sucked mercilessly along, unable to control his movement, desperately needing to take a breath. He reached for the side, for the bottom, for anything, but there was nothing there. He could not tell which direction was up, down, left, or right anymore. He realized he was floating downstream backwards now. Any second, he half expected vertigo to hit as he shot out over the waterfalls and fell over and off into the oblivion of plummeting death. The thunder was coming just ahead. It thrummed in his aching ears. He screamed under the water and tensed all of his muscles in preparation for the launch. His hand touched something in the water, and he seized it as fast as a snake striking its prey. It was shirt cloth. He pulled and clenched onto an arm. He could tell it was young King Day. Suddenly, Gabriel himself was caught by someone as well, seizing him by the hair and collar, yanking him to a stop. He felt the water pull hard against him as he swung around and crashed into a halt into the rocks at the side of the stream. Another hand seized him by the wrist. His face rose above the surface, and he sucked in as much air as he could between his clenched teeth, spitting out the omnipresent moths, clinging precariously to a greasy, slimy rock, with Jameson choking at his bosom. Someone still held him by his hair, and they yanked him up and out of the stream with struggling effort, pulling the boy along with him. Another hand, a strong one, seized his belt and lifted him up and out of the river. Gabriel thought that it was Binder, but he could not be sure. He tried to speak, but he could not. In fact, he felt as though he were smothering to death. The boy encircled his arms around Gabriel's waist. They were on solid ground, again at least, but on which shore he was unsure. He was so weak that he nearly faltered to his knees several times. He felt a loop go around his wrist again, this one tight, and it jerked him forward. Exhausted, confused, and in shock, Gabriel came to his feet and began to follow whoever it was who had saved him. At that point, he didn't care who it was. He just wanted to get out of that living hell. Once again, the moths began calling to him. "Shut up!" he cried out. He tried to ignore them, but even his anger and fear of disgrace did not aid him while passing through the great domain of the gray aerodares. Down there in their valley, the insects ruled, not him, nor any man nor beast. In another few seconds, he was hypnotized again, dreamily and blissfully sleepwalking again under the powerful spell of the horrible moths of Aerogreen, without a single care left in the world. Fortunately for him this time, his wrists were securely tied and someone else was now in control, dragging him back to safety and reality. See you into chapter 7. Next chapter will be chapter 8, The Wizard Story.